Welcome back to Talk Jamaica here on Talk Jamaica Radio. We are streaming live on talkjamaicaradio.com. My name is Ralston Chamberlain.
And I'm Andrew D. White. The controversy surrounding campaign financing in the opposition People's National Party continues to deepen. Early last week, party leader Portia Simpson Miller said she was unaware of the campaign funding scandal that triggered a fresh round of conflict within the ranks of the fractious opposition.
She has since asked the party's Integrity Commission to investigate the claims that some PNP candidates have not remitted campaign donations.
Just yesterday, reports emerged that Treasurer Norman Horn has been assigned police bodyguard after threats were issued against him. His report triggered the campaign financing scandal now rocking the PNP. To discuss these issues, we're joined by attorney at law Clyde Williams, former Deputy General Secretary of the PNP Raymond Pryce, and aide to Prime Minister Andrew Holness, Marlon Morgan. Hello, gentlemen. Good evening. Hello.
Yes, good evening to your listeners. Raymond, Wagwan.
I gather Raymond is not on with us as yet.
Is this Mr. Williams?
And Clyde.
Oh, okay.
Yes, this is Clyde. Good evening to your listeners.
And I'm here. Marlon Morgan is on.
Okay.
Your voice sounds strong, man.
Gentlemen.
Well, I wouldn't have it otherwise, eh?
My on to business, gentlemen. My first question is to Clyde, Mr. Williams. What is your own view on campaign finance legislation? And I need to follow you up with another question, a legal question.
That's fine. I guess on the Jamaican landscape, I would be seen as radical, probably liberal in American sense, but certainly not conservative.
Right.
My own view is that campaign finance really should find itself located in a wider piece of legislation that deals with the status of a political party and the extent to which some issues in the political party are to the part of discussions in the public space, and to which, to some extent, areas where the party may claim private issues and so forth. So my own view is that we need a comprehensive piece of legislation that gives legal character and personality to political parties. As you know, they're not defined in the Constitution.
Right.
Many persons see them as private institutions, but my own view is that given the purpose for which they exist, which is public, and the use of public power through government control of the executive, then it seems to me that's where we need to go, and campaign finance would be just a chapter in that piece of legislation.
I share that same view, actually, Mr. Williams, but I would also want to ask you, do you think that the state should fund then political parties, having established them within a legislative framework?
All right. Here's my take on it. It is a question of timing. At this juncture, I think it would be unwise to ask Jamaican taxpayers to fund a system that they have little control over, how things operate, and in many instances lack transparency. I'm not speaking about the PNP or the JP. I'm speaking about the political party practice.
Right, which is why I said to you, within the framework of the legislation that you have proposed. So once we have the legislation that outlines what a political party ought to be, their terms of reference, best practices, etc., then would you then support state-funded support of political parties?
Yes. At that time, I would be in a better position to assess my position. In principle, I agree that it may serve a purpose of keeping dirty money outside and may, in fact, level the playing field for small candidates who do not have lots of financial backing, legal or otherwise.
Exactly.
So, yes, there are some positions that theoretically and in principle that you can see how they would work. I would still reserve on whether we should and the timetable for it.
To what extent? And to how much? And to what extent?
that's a discussion for another time. I'd have to wrap my
Right.
head around some of the contending views. And I'd also want to benefit from the discussion of other positions so that
Okay.
I could be more informed.
All right. I have a question for you, Mr. Morgan. You're the aide to the Prime Minister, and I have been quite vocal on social media, as had the former contractor Greg Christie, calling for a mandatory minimum. I don't know if learned counsel Clyde Williams supports me on this, but a mandatory minimum of 2 years for anyone found guilty of corruption as a public official or in a public office. Um, or any Jamaican. So any Jamaican found guilty of corruption would be sentenced to a mandatory minimum 2 years and an additional 1 year if while found guilty, you were found guilty as a public official or in the public office. What do you know if the government has any intentions of bringing any kind of legislation that would, and I mean strong anti-corruption legislation that would send a strong signal that corruption will not be tolerated in the Jamaican space?
Well, first of all, thanks Ross and thanks Andrew for having me on. The truth is, we all know how desirable it is for us to mobilize all our efforts and our energies to tackle and combat in decisive ways the scourge of corruption, particularly in public office and across the political landscape generally. In terms of current moves or considerations insofar as legislation to
I'm sorry, Marlon. I can hardly hear you, and some of the listeners say that they're having difficulties. Would it be possible for you to speak up a little more? I know you have a loud,
well, yes, and
robust
I'm
voice.
certain. Am I coming across a bit better now?
Yeah, a little better. Thank you.
Well, yes. So as I'm saying, it's obviously desirable to move in a systematic way towards strengthening our corruption or anti-corruption framework here in Jamaica as a whole. As to whether we are contemplating, meaning the government is contemplating moves to strengthen or to go about having minimum sentences, I can't say it at this point in time, but the truth is I wouldn't be averse to such a move because I am uppermost in my mind would be the mischief that we're seeking to correct here. Yes, generally speaking, as it is now, it is the judiciary that makes a determination as to how punitive a sentence or punishment is in relation to infringements or breaches of the Corruption Prevention Act. Now, as to whether minimum sentences would serve as a deterrent, that can always be debated, but I would see that as something to which I am not averse. And I just want to speak quickly to something that Clive has mentioned, because Clive has quite rightly pointed out the importance of moving political parties in terms of our understandings of them out of the realm of the private members club, yes? And that is something that is quite frankly welcome. As to whether Jamaica can countenance at this time state financing of public political parties, we know that is what poses a particular challenge, because if you think about it, I recall that both sides of the House then, the then governing PNP and the then opposition JLP, when the campaign financing legislation was being debated in Parliament, expressed in principle support for what is set out. The challenge we've had with bringing the regulations on board now is because we're still seeking to determine the modalities of it. How it is that we really go about having state funding, because there are some undesirables that we're actually seeking to ward off, such things as state capture by persons who wield considerable power, meaning persons in corporate Jamaica or in the private sector generally, who would seek to exercise undue influence on public policy. So Raymond and I are agreed on that score.
It's great when they...
Go ahead, Clive, and then I'm going to bring in Raymond Pryce.
Right.
I'd love to know.
I wanted to comment quickly. Raymond, are you there?
Yes, I am. Good evening. Sorry for joining late.
No problem. I'm going to yield to Raymond, and then I'll speak to the question of the anti-corruption agency, because
Yes,
as Raymond just joined us.
right. So let me put to you then, Raymond, former Deputy General Secretary of the PNP, your view on the issue of campaign finance. Why is it that the legislation has taken us so long? Are we dragging our feet on this issue?
All right. Are we dragging our feet? I think we are. But the we I'm speaking of are not the 63 legislators in Garden House. I know Garden House is a very important venue, but it is not the only venue for the protection of our democracy. My concern is bigger than whether we're dragging our feet or whether we're moving any at all. I am now of the view that the legislation recently passed, as I had indicated when it was being debated in Garden House, did not, in my view, go far enough. And I'm not talking about fines, I'm not talking about sentences, I'm not talking about those kinds of aspects of it. What I'm talking about is the fact that the countries that we measure ourselves against, the countries that we love to love, your Denmark, your Switzerland, your Sweden, your Norway, your what's left of the United Kingdom, those countries have long since gone beyond campaign reform. Now, let us look at the recent situation that has caused this conversation. In 2006, the campaign period began on January 31, when the then Prime Minister announced that Parliament would have been dissolved on February 5 and elections would have been held on February 25. So the last campaign we have seen in a general election lasted 20 days. Those donations within 20 days on the current law in Jamaica, had they passed 250,000 Jamaican dollars, would needed to have been reported to the Electoral Commission of Jamaica. The Electoral Commission of Jamaica, and I heard Professor Trevor Monroe support this view recently in an interview on another radio program, that the Electoral Commission of Jamaica has seated on it two persons from both major political parties, including Mr. Paul Burke, about whom much of what we have been discussing has been generated. Now, if within the current framework for something as low as $250,000, there have been no reports, as far as we in the public know, to the Electoral Commission, then we must by now realize that to focus on a campaign period, which could be as little as 20 days, is insufficient. Now, nobody likes to say, I told you so. And believe you me, my former Breakfast Club colleague, Marlon Morgan, may want to challenge me on this view, but not even I like to say, I told you so. But when in 2013, I tabled a private member's motion that asks for the registration and formalization of civil society groups, lobby groups, special interest groups, and persons who the British refer to as public influencers, who would seek, which is their right, to advocate to legislators and government officials for certain outcomes. That the modern world recognizes that such lobby, such advocacy is a part of modern business and political societies. And therefore, they have put in programs and procedures to monitor how these operations are conducted. I recall that even the civil society groups that we describe as watchdogs for our democracy revolted against the motion because they thought that Jamaica did not have the kind of lobby orchestration that most more developed countries had. Now, when you review, if you look through the lenses of whether it is Omar Davis's letter or the original statements in the media, published in the media, which are supposedly to have originated from Norman Horn, or even Missing Stone and the hog we get lick squeal Jamaican adage that was applied in the midst of all of this discussion. I would invite everybody who opposed the motion then, or forget the motion. I would invite everybody who say that their interest is the robustness and protection of Jamaica's democracy to review the suggestions of the previous week's publications and ask yourselves if indeed Jamaica is like all of the other developed democracies and societies in need of laws that not only monitor political parties during a campaign period, but monitor access to the influence of decisions taken by both elected and non-elected persons, and whether or not some of those decisions can be guided by other interests other than the public good. And if we are not prepared to have that conversation, then we can get the regulations in place for an obsolete legislation. And 4 years later, whether it is Manat or anything else, we all tear our hair out of our heads and say, why does this constantly happen in Jamaica?
Mm-hmm. You wanted to make a point, Clyde, before Raymond came in.
Oh, yes, I was saying concerning the one corruption agency.
Mm-hmm.
I think that debate, quite frankly, I measure persons on their output, and I measure our parliamentarians and politicians on our output. They could never be serious about stamping out corruption. If you look at how we treat with the fiscal legislative framework required of us of the external entity IMF, the dispatch with which we dealt with it, then, and when you look at how we have dealt with the question, we haven't even discussed and finalized how we're going to approach the tackling of corruption. There is an issue as to whether or not you should make the same agency have prosecutorial powers and powers to investigate. People think there may be problems with that. Well, let's have the discussion. Let's sign off and do something about this. The investigative capacity, it appears, in the current dispensation is not apparently sufficient or incisive enough, so we get nobody being convicted of corruption. And everybody knows it's eating up the soul of the country. So for me, I ask, why can't we have that bit of legislation? Why can't we come to a decision as to which of the frameworks we are going to use, strengthen that framework so we can start seeing some results?
Mm-hmm. Let me put this to Marlon Morgan, because the Andrew Holness administration is now in power. Do you think now that the onus is on Mr. Holness to run with this issue of campaign finance reform and also to take on board the suggestion laid out this afternoon by Raymond Pryce and Pryor in his private members' motion?
Well, one thing's for certain, the country, and certainly in light of what we have had emanating from the Storm and Horn report, is impatient of such a move. So a word to the wise, as they say, Ralston, would be entirely sufficient. And I trust that we're going to have and efforts going on at pace to bring the legislation. But I take note of what Raymond has quite understandably cautioned, because what Raymond is suggesting is that it would be remiss, advised of government and the legislature as a whole to be seeking to move in this direction without addressing some of those fundamental concerns enumerated and raised, certainly when they had the debate on his private members' motion, a debate I recall quite vividly. Because one of the sad things about it is that in that debate, some key considerations got lost. A note, as Raymond has said, that there were some people who took umbrage to the general gist of the discussion during that debate, but they were not mindful of some of the key considerations underpinning it, such as sources of funding. So when you have a national integrity action, a Jamaican for justice, what powers are there behind the scenes exerting influence or bringing some sort of influence to bear on the pursuit of their mandate as a civil society grouping and so on?
I want to comment quickly.
May I ask? Okay. Is this
Yes,
Clyde?
and this is Clyde. Yes, I'm not
And I
knocking
have a
what Raymond
question
has
for you
said.
as soon as you're finished.
Cool. I'm not knocking what Raymond has said, but I can tell you why persons in society, I mean, civil society, had issues with that. It had a lot to do with a perception that, listen, why don't you guys seek to regulate the corrupt? This is a whole. Why don't you guys seek to regulate the operations of corrupt political parties? Some people call it the gangs of West of Garden House. And a notable newspaper here has referred to them as such. Why don't you guys lay legislation to deal with public corruption and straighten that? And I'm not saying it wasn't how what Raymond is saying. I'm just saying that many in the public think that it is less of a priority right now than to straighten out political parties, their funding, their operations, and to deal with public corruption, prosecution, and investigation and such. So that was, I think, partly why it made it such a distance, because people think in the scheme of overall things, it wasn't priority.
No, but actually, Clyde, and as I said, I'm not going to belabor the private members' motion. It's going to be one day the issue of the work of academics as to whether or not we need that kind of robustness or not. But just for clarity and just for information's sake, the motion was not limited to civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, and lobby groups. It also, and it actually began with political parties. The point of the matter, though, is let us consider the democracy, and a democracy and an economy are linked to a society. So let us consider the society as a major highway. The civil society groups, the political parties, the lobby groups, the advocates, the individual, let's say the churches, let us say the community neighborhood watches, are vehicles on that highway. Now, whether you are driving in a Benz SUV of recent vintage or a Lada, once you are on that highway, the certain codes and conditions for use of the highway apply. I am humbly suggesting, Clyde and Marlon, as well as through you, the host, to your listeners, that unless we treat the highway and all of its users with some amount of equalness, then we are going to have a situation. Clean up your house before you speak to me, but therefore I can speed beyond 110, but you must not go above 50. And that kind of inherent disequality with our unequalness is a time of the past. When you can go on crowdfunding, Fund Me, the social media platform that says Fund Me, where you put up an idea and people who may or may not be known to you support the idea and decide to put money towards that. Those things need in a modern world, just as though it is done in the countries we love to love, they need to be considered appropriate for Jamaica. And the legislation that... Yeah, go ahead.
Don't get me wrong, Raymond. I don't think anybody disagrees. I think my own position and your argument, this is my position, is that there's a disproportionality here being put forward. Nobody's saying we mustn't deal with civil societies and the group. Nobody's saying that. What persons are saying that the significant wielder of power behind the scenes are political parties because they furnish people to run for office, and we need to...
No, but Clyde, step away from the point.
Hang on. Yes, no, hang on. I'm not stepping away. I'm going to debate the same point. Hang on. So here's what people are saying. What people are saying is that, of course, we expect all of these things to happen. But when you lump it, so you have generalities, political parties are fundamentally different from civil society groups. Why? Political parties seek power of office and constitutional power through that office, not civil society, to tax us and to borrow money on our behalf. So many persons say, we agree with you, Raymond, but right now, Raymond, we have more critical and telling issues to deal with, to have our draftspersons drafting a piece of legislation to deal with these various groups. So it's a question of prioritizing what's critical right now.
All right, fair point. But let me ask you this question. Let us, and by the way, let me make it clear, I am not either supportive or confirming or refuting the veracity or lack thereof of any accusations that have recently come about. As a matter of fact, I want to go on record before illustrating the point. I want to go on record as a citizen of Jamaica to thank the government and people of the People's Republic of China for all of their kindness through loans and developmental aid that they have provided to the people of Jamaica over many years, going back to when Jamaica first publicly expressed its support for the One China policy. Some of the assertions that have been made have led to the Embassy of the People's Republic of China issuing a statement, which I think is a new development in the local body politic. But having said that, let us say that the assertions that we see published in the media based on allegations and counter-allegations are correct. That so-called $20 million did not originate from a political party. That so-called $20 million came from what could either have been a lobby group, a special interest group, a non-governmental entity, or a private entity. Without further, what I would want us to consider, in the absence of legislation that looks beyond, or scrutiny that looks beyond Marlon, Morgan, and Raymond Pryce as the two only activist politicians in this conversation, if we keep focusing on Marlon and Raymond alone, the rest of the supporting infrastructure that could seek to corrupt Marlon or Raymond will get away with, if they can't corrupt Marlon directly or Raymond directly, corrupting persons connected to or known to be a part of the same game that Marlon and I are active in, and we would still then have a problem. I'm not knocking civil society, and I'm not knocking the current.
Gentlemen, 1 minute, gentlemen. This is Andrea. I don't want to belabor the point because I want to ask a question to Clyde, and then to Marlon, and then to Raymond. I want to ask because I know, Clyde, you're correct me if I'm wrong, but you still sit on the HR committee, the Human Rights Committee of the PNP, and I would like to know what are your views on what is happening in the PNP, and do you think that the PNP will be able to recover in time if we have a local government election by the end of this year?
I don't sit on the Human Rights Commission anymore.
Okay.
It's one of those things that best left right there.
Right. Okay.
Concerning. Honestly, let me call it how I see it. The parties existing in elections and to form government. I don't think so they will have to contest. I expect that. The dangers of an imminent election is a loss of focus. So I think that what is likely to occur if there is a local government election very soon is that the momentum to deal with what are in fact significant issues in the PNP, dogging the PNP, that the focus will be lost. And after the election, I don't think we will, in fact, have another opportunity, as is presented now, to deal with these issues. So for me, if I am calling the shots or part of the persons, and I'm not, I'm just one of those comrades who happen to be able to vote for the leader, delegate, as it were. The focus would be on a refashioning, re-energizing, retooling of the People's National Party. And as some people have said, finding our soul again. And I understand that we have to have elections. But the approach would be, how do we renew this party, and not so much whether or not we do a good showing in the local government elections.
Okay. Marlon, what say you?
Well, first of all, it's understandable to appreciate and recognize the lens through which many persons would respond to an issue such as this. We, as persons actively engaged in politics, would pander to, yes, what seems to be the demise of our opponent. But for me, it's a much larger issue, and I'm not one of those persons salivating at what is happening in the PNP, because I know behind all of this, there is this notion and specter of corruption of the body politic as a whole, meaning both the JLP and the PNP. And those things are things that are worthy of being shunned and are undesirable. But what is of concern here is that to the extent that we have a local government election looming, you may well have further downward movements in voter turnout. You recall, on February 25, some 47% of the electorate came out. And that's the real challenge I have. People like Raymond and myself are vested in and actively engaged in trying to attract persons to the political process, as we really and truly should be and should do. Yes? Because participation helps to enhance our democracy. And of course, Raymond is from a place where they speak about participation, accountability, and responsibility. And that's why they say it can't be seen as the province of the PNP. Every Jamaican should really seek to, identify with and understand the importance of that across the board in terms of enhancing our democracy and moving our people in such a way as to secure that which is good and best for Jamaica at all times.
Okay, I take your point. Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Pryce, and I also want to ask you another question. Do you agree with the call by civil society for an independent investigation in what is happening in the PNP? So 2 questions for you.
All right. The first one is, allow me to answer by reference to a metaphor. At the Jamaica National Survey Olympics, a lot of us were disappointed, concerned even, when the Honorable Ukraine Board had to bow out of a race. But we all celebrated with his refined performances in Rio, just concluded. Sometimes it's best to bow out of a race when you are not at your best, so that you protect your muscles and your energies and your opportunities for the real race down the road. I say all of that to say, I am far more concerned with the refinement, renewal, recovery of the People's National Party as a believable and credible contributor to Jamaica's development than I am for the individual races, however they are scheduled. On to your second question with respect to the call for outside investigation. I go back to where I began. There is already something called the ECJ. The existing laws which protect and undergird the ECJ require certain reports to be made. Someone who is linked to these public utterances sits on the ECJ. The ECJ is a commission of parliament appointed by His Excellency the Governor General. The ECJ can act as it is currently constituted without one additional piece of legislation. Until and unless it does that, it will become like one of those other vehicles on the highway, that metaphor I used earlier, that is not following the rules which currently exist.
So I just want to make sure.
My country's democracy, my country's global integrity is far more important than the individual points or medals that we as political athletes will win from time to time. And I'll go further to say this. The Jamaican adage which says, today for me, tomorrow for you. In my short time in the political arena, I have seen 2008 to 2012, where there was a credible argument that Jamaica's global reputation was besmirched. I saw 2012 to 2016, when there was a credible argument that Jamaica's reputation globally was restored. I am now seeing these events, which have already caused not one, but 2 foreign governments through their embassies to comment on the situation about which we are speaking. I am Jamaican.
Okay,
I
thank
was
you.
born a Jamaican. And that
Thank
to
you,
me is
Mr.
far more
Pryce.
important than any of the other aspects of the conversation.
All right,
Okay, thank you.
gentlemen, can I want to bring the discussion to a close. And so I'm going to ask, we have heard about the issues rocking the PNP. We have heard about the whole thing of campaign finance reform and the issues that Raymond has, and Clyde has debated. I want to ask you, Marlon, because though this issue is dogging the PNP, the broader issue is the body politics, yes? And so where do we go from here? What are we to expect? What are the people supposed to expect from our politics?
Well, first of all, at a minimum, we have to safeguard this democracy of ours by the institutional and systemic mechanisms. And one such place to look at is the legislative environment. And separate and apart from that, one cannot overlook the call, and reasonable call, I believe, for some sort of independent investigative look at what is alleged to have happened in this instant matter, because persons are not just going to walk away from this particular issue like that, although, others would hope that that is the case. And for us to restore some semblance of, integrity perhaps to the process, you're going to have the public, members of the public coming away with those reasonable assurances at the very least.
Yeah,
All right.
I want to comment on this notion of independent investigation into what's going on in the PNP. And I start specifically the campaign finance issues. I start from the first premise of what is the authority of the investigating body, whichever body you ask to do it. This independent body, what would be their authority? And at the end of it, how does it figure and factor in when you look at the PNP's constitution insofar as dealing with matters that are alleged to be breaches of conduct, wider conduct, political conduct, or even matters that there are allegations of criminal impropriety. So when people speak about independent investigations, and I'm saying, by what authority? And what will you clothe the authority with? And what will be the powers of the authority to summon witnesses? How would they achieve those things? And that's the reason why you have constitutional framework. So my own position on this, the matter ought to be dealt with in the matter that is foreshadowed by the bylaws of the People's National Party. Until such legislation that will have the matter dealt with otherwise, for the time being, it seems to me that there must be some jurisdiction grounded and authority derived for a body to investigate the People's National Party. And it cannot be extra constitutional, in my own respectful submission.
All right, in 30 seconds, Raymond Pryce, where do we go from here?
All right, firstly, I'm not an attorney at law. Clyde is. So I find, I won't say comfort, I'm guided by his responses on the matter just now. Where do we go from here? There is an agency which the PNP is an adherent to. It's called the Electoral Commission of Jamaica. The Representation of the People's Act speaks to a specific figure of 250,000 Jamaican dollars. The assertions are of a figure beyond that. The question is, has the ECJ's switch been triggered? Is the process already available to us in law? Is that process being pursued? And you see, sometimes you have to look as to how somebody will behave in the future based on how they behaved in the past. If we are not working with the laws that currently exist, what confidence does an ordinary Jamaica have that we will change when we change the law in terms of our behavior?
All right, gentlemen, can we thank you for having joined us this afternoon? We really appreciate it.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank
All right,
you.
listeners, you heard there, Attorney at Law Clyde Williams, former Deputy General Secretary of the PNP Raymond Pryce, and aide to Prime Minister Andrew Holness Marlon Morgan, weighing in on the issue of campaign financing and the debacle, if one might call it that is dogging the People's National Party.